Hi, sorry. Bonsoir tout le monde, merci d'être venu. Je m'appelle Stéphanie Nadeau, je suis la commissaire à la médiation culturelle à la Galerie d'art d'Ottawa. L'événement se déroulera en anglais, mais si vous avez des questions à poser en français, n'hésitez pas, on peut faciliter la traduction. Welcome, my name is Stephanie Nadeau. I'm the Curator of Public Engagement at the Ottawa Art Gallery. I do wish to acknowledge that we are in the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Thank you all for coming to tonight's event in conversation with exhibition artist Nicola feldman-kiss and hosted by the artistic director of Artengine Ryan Stec. The talk is being recorded, so I just want to be clear about that. It's for broadcast purposes, so just an audio will be put onto YouTube. So just bear that in mind when you're asking your questions. Also, we have that your voice is being put out into the ether. Also, we have a sign-up sheet outside if you'd like to hear more about our programming. You can feel free to put your email down there. And I invite you all to join us after the talk for drinks and nibbles, which will be provided free at the table outside. So thank you all for coming tonight. And as always, I'd like to thank our funders, the City of Ottawa, the Ontario Arts Council, and the Canada Council for the Arts. So I'm going to read out our speakers' bios. We have Ryan Stec, who is an artist, producer, and designer working in both research and production. He's interested in the cross-sections of technology, creativity, and the built environment. His most recent work is focused on interventions that redefine how we experience the city around us. He is artistic director of Artengine, as I mentioned, which is a center for art, design, and research here in the capital, and has been heavily involved in the artist-run culture of Ottawa since 1998. He is currently pursuing a PhD in architecture at Carleton University. Nicola feldman-kiss is a Toronto-based artist, or I like to say an Ottawa artist currently based in Toronto. She explores relational interpretations of body and embodiment, identity and autobiography, witness and traumatic memory. She is a multilingual artist of Canadian, German, and Jamaican ancestry whose work examines autobiographical themes and acts as a socio-political commentary addressing, among other topics, the impact and traces of her own German-Jamaican heritage on the development of a plural identity. Feldman-Kiss earned a BFA in photography at the University of Ottawa in 1991 and an MFA in photography and art criticism studies, art and critical studies at the California Institute of Arts in 1996. Feldman-Kiss's work has been featured in many exhibitions. A solo exhibition entitled Nicola feldman-kiss Mean Body, 2006 to 2008. It toured to venues in Ontario and Quebec, Italy, the UK, Finland, Sweden, Mexico, Switzerland, and the US. Recent works relating to conflict culture and mass migration have been the subject of the cross-Canada touring exhibition Terms of Engagement, which first came out in 2014. She's participated in many residencies and worked with several research institutes. I'm sure we'll hear about some of those projects in the talk. So thank you, and please join me in welcoming Nicola and Ryan.
I think in terms of where I think it's interesting to start, and I think for you, it's interesting to start because of our conversations before and over the years we talked about these things. Is thinking about tools. The tools, for you, what is the relationship between the tools and the variety of tools that you use, but also that relationship to process. How you think about the tools in which you take up and engage and develop your work with. Is that enough there now? I'll forewarn you, they will always be rather long questions. I'm not good at very precise and incisive questions.
I guess I like tools. I had a professor in graduate school at Cal Arts, which is just north of Los Angeles, a conceptual artist named Michael Asher. And he and I worked closely together in my second year of my graduate studies. And for my thesis show, I produced a series of works which were both sculptural and photographic. And I first used a router on a piece of aluminum for that work. And I've been very in love with the tool of the router, and also in love with the material of aluminum. And when I put the router to the aluminum, I realized that the aluminum was not solid, but more like butter. And that kind of experience of the interface between the router and the aluminum it taught me a lot about what materiality is, and I started to think of things that were solid as liquid. And I was so excited about this revelation. I was ready to wear a router on my neck as a piece of jewelry. And he said to me, "No, Nicola, let go of the tools. An artist should never own tools, and an artist should never be committed to tools. Because once we get a commitment to tools, we're compelled to use them, and then the tool drives the work as opposed to the idea." And I think that was the first time I really decided to let down the tools, and at that point also kind of abandoned the camera as a principal tool in my toolkit. Although I still relate to photography as my primary discipline, and I relate very strongly to the idea of camera vision as what I bring into my practice. So whether I'm making sculpture or bent glass or writing text, I still really do believe I'm making photographs. So there are a few people, like Michael Snow, for example, he says, no matter what he makes, whether it's a drawing or a sculpture or a film or a photograph or any other kind of intervention, he always enters those works as a filmmaker. And so like Michael, I enter all my work as a photographer.
But it's interesting in what that kind of revelation and that kind of, let's say, creating a distance between the tool and not becoming necessarily simply outputting what the tool is, but trying to somehow subvert it. And yet, you end up with a very deep relationship to a variety of tools. And I mean, the mean body grouping of work is quite a profound relationship to a set of tools that aren't necessarily considered artistic tools. Typically, mean body being this body of work in which she's the 360-degree scan of herself, and the production of the sort of the small figures that we see there that are very precisely done with a set of scientific and production tools. And so in the end, your process is you threw yourself into these tools for them to also to see how much perhaps you could change them and get out something out of it. But there must have been a lot of things that you never knew were going to come out of it because of what the tools and the infrastructure around the tools were.
Well, certainly one thing leads to another, and the getting myself scanned in the main body project, and the little bronze we see here is a derivative of that work, came out as a reliquarium, which we see as a grid on the wall. And for the reliquarium, I spent the year 2000 scanning objects on my desktop scanner, and it was rather exciting to make photographs at that time, having bypassed the camera altogether. And in fact, at that time in the development of technology, I was able to get a super high resolution image out of an extremely, middle of the road, not, a medium quality consumer scanner that was already kind of outdated. And that scanner was able to produce photographs of much higher resolution than any digital camera that I might have dreamed of affording at the time. And so as I progressed through the year of this diary, scanning more and more things and developing my scanning skills, I began to scan things that were you know, more complicated and ultimately much bigger than the scanner, and I would scan them in parts and assemble them together. The fact that the objects that I wanted to image with the scanner outgrew the size of the scanner, that brought me to this 3D scanner, because at once it dawned on me that the scanner was too small, and the thing I wanted to scan that was too big for the scanner and too complex to do in parts was my body. And so towards the end of that project, I really turned myself and the primary thrust of my work to figuring out how I could scan my body. And it was the idea of scanning my body that brought me to the 3D scanner. I didn't really know about 3D scanners when I decided to get myself scanned. So it was the, it was the vision of scanning a body that brought me into knowledge of a set of tools and ultimately inspired me to build the necessary partnerships to fulfill, the artistic vision.
And sort of, can you see through, was there a very similar arc for that process that you went through with, say, a lot of the other works? And I mean, I think in particular there, but probably through also the eye piece, not just an intense engagement with tools in order to figure out how to get you towards the arc of this 3D scanning of your body, but also the technicians and this kind of collaborative relationship, or do you see it as a collaborative relationship with the technicians who sort of mediate your relationship to increasingly sophisticated tools?
Oh, definitely, I see it as a collaboration. I don't think that the people who I work with generally see it as a collaboration, though, because they really are working towards my vision, not theirs. I'm exploiting other people's skills, usually to help me to meet my artistic goals. However, people who work with me because they're inspired by my work. It's not for financial compensation, and sometimes my projects inspire growth and innovations within their works and their research processes. I call it a collaboration because I'm in complete dependence, and without the skills of these fine craftsmen and researchers and technicians, I would not be able to get my work out of the imaginary and into the material realm.
Well, and it's interesting, too, I never really thought of it in this way when you're describing it. There's a lot of vulnerability in your work in general, and that's actually quite a significant other layer of vulnerability, which is probably not necessarily directly accessible in the work, but in order to the kind of technicians that you need to do, they're not typically technicians who are dealing with artwork in any capacity. And so not only are you trying to get them to do a piece of creative work, but it's a creative work that's usually fairly challenging and perhaps difficult to explain. So it must be, that in and of itself must also be quite a process of vulnerability.
Well, certainly with the mean body work, there was a lot of vulnerability. And it was also the first major work that I did completely dependent on technical collaborators. And there was a discomfort that I needed to get past, especially working on my naked body, so I had myself scanned. But when when a body is scanned, it is not immediately ready to output as a 3D print or even as just a digital file. So there's a tremendous amount of modeling and digital sculpting that has to happen. And to be working with my naked body with a young male technician, there were moments of vulnerability and feeling of extreme nakedness, when we're modeling my crotch, for example. It's not, working within a kind of a scientific domain, data is just data, and I had to sort of adopt that perspective onto my data and, in a way, dissociate from my representation in order to be in a comfortable position in that collaboration.
And you're mentioning there the idea of working within a kind of scientific context, and one of the questions I was thinking about is how you understand and also kind of navigate your own personal definitions of what you see as where sort of science begins and where technology begins. because there's a, you know, you can see science as a kind of, you can see technology as a kind of applied science, but you can also see science as a kind of collection of technologies. And I think we each have our own sort of understanding of where we might think science and technology kind of end or overlap or what their relationship is. But you've spent quite a lot of time over the years in engaging in those communities, not just the lean body, but also with the eye. And then I think also, you know, intellectually and artistically, even when the projects aren't directly related.
My sort of exploitation of the science realm to pursue my vision is, it's rather instrumental. I think that once upon a time, like in the early years when I was working out of the National Research Council, I might have had some ideas that I was contributing to science. But in retrospect, I think that the science was contributing to me. And certainly I was contributing to the sort of expanding the ideas of the scientists in the work that they do, for sure. Like when I did get scanned and I was working with the Visual Information Technology Group at the National Research Council, you know, they were always astounded with the extremely relevant questions that I came up with and the limits that I pushed the technologies that they were developing to. But it wasn't necessarily because I had any particular science knowledge or science talent or particular science comfort, for example. It was, I really think that as an artist, I come in wide open, without limitations. And the more we know about a subject sometimes, the less we know about a subject. And so if I go to a senior scientist and I say, you know, I want to do this, that, and the other, and he says, oh, well, that's never been done. We don't know if we can do it. We'll try. And then it happens. The piece isn't in the show, but as part of the main body project, I produced a book called Classically Bound, and that book was, you know, almost 8,000 pages of source code just showing the graphic representation. It was really just 3 columns of numbers showing the position in 3D of all of the data points necessary to form basically a 3D graph, which was the body shape from the scan. And I was sitting with a technician one day, and we were working on developing some algorithms to abstract some of the body forms, and suddenly it dawned on me, well, what's behind the graphical user interface? Well, we all know it's called a graphical user interface, and so something is feeding the data into the image. I'd like to see the data that's supporting the image. And so we opened up the file in a text software instead of a 3D graphic software, and that became the book. It was just a very simple question. It dawned on me in that moment that those algebraic equations that I did in, you know, high school math that resulted in a pyramid or a cone represented on a 2D graph were very simple objects that were directly related to the very complex object of the body shape. And I didn't think there was any particular brilliance in that, but it shows that I didn't have a limitation on my thinking, and the technician did have a limitation on his thinking. And at that point he said to me that, well, I was a very abstract thinker. And I don't know if I'm an abstract thinker or not, but somehow I asked a very little simple question that really exploded into a new sort of idea of representation.
And so for, no, I ask a different question. I think in terms of the, let's say the representation of the self or the extension of the self, and in your early work there's a lot of stuff around that extension through technology. I think, you know, particularly, I can't remember the name of the project on the site, but where your webcam and your network and your
Project Molly.
Yes, but this these projects here still have, even though they're not so directly looking at technology, like a more obvious version of technology as an extension of the self, I think there's still that in there. How do you see that kind of navigation of that extension? Both, is it mainly in the idea of content, or is there also something in the kind of tools and the process?
Well, you know, I had a conceptual art education, even though my work doesn't particularly look like conceptual art because it's so representational. But I learned early that the meaning begins at the most granular level. So the meaning in the artwork begins with the selection of the tool and the selection of the materials. And so if I do a work in photography, such as this one, or a work in performance, the first thing I decide is I have an idea that needs to get out, and what's the best mechanism for its release. And that's where the tool choices are made and the material choices are made. But my works really start as visions, and the choices of tool and material come second. And so it's really the vision that I am most interested in pursuing. But just to comment about me, about that project, Molly. This was in 2002 or 2001 or 2 or something, and I was hanging out at the National Research Council, and I had a desk there, and they had been given a wearable computer by a company called Cybernaut. And I don't really know why exactly that they were given that tool, but nobody knew what to do with it, so they gave it to me and said, maybe you can do something with it. And that's the unique project that I've entered through the tool. And I have a very uncomfortable relationship with that work. And because I didn't choose it, in a way, you know, in a way it feels more like a commission than a piece of like, I certainly put my imprint onto the tool with my work, but it really felt more like, you know, it came from an external source.
But at the same time, the book, that couldn't have been, that wasn't part of your vision. The book was just one of the very powerful parts of Mean Body. You had no idea that book was going to emerge, right? And so there is a very significant and what probably was a quite arduous process to get such a large book made. Becomes a kind of result of that interaction as well. That it certainly isn't. I don't see a kind of mapped arc towards the enactment of your vision. There's still quite a lot of happy accidents, let's say, or revelations that come through that process.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, especially with that particular body of work, because I was really pursuing a project that was about abstracting the body and decategorizing the body and dissecting the body into fragments that weren't of traditional categories that come out of anatomy. And so I was really working at the National Research Council to develop a set of algorithms to give a logic to my dissection. And everything else, and that project became the Chimera set. And everything else that came out of that body of work, which is a lot of work, were projects that, oh, on the way I can make this, and on the way I can make that. So one of the pieces I did was a grid of 360 images of that particular model that's standing there. And what I did is I made a very simple small script asking the software to rotate the 3D model and take a picture of it every 1 degree. And that was very instrumental because at that time in 2001, there was no viewer that, I work on a Mac environment, and there was no viewer for 3D models for Macintosh at that time. And so in order to view the scan models, I needed to make movies out of them. You helped me make one of the movies out of them, actually. And so they were like very simple GIF animations. And I would scroll in order to edit down I had maybe 160 original scans, and I edited it down to, I think, 84 is in the final database. But I had to view all of those and understand them and decide which ones I would work on. And so this grid of 360 photos was sort of already made because you know, it was just sort of a practical exercise. So a lot of the pieces in that particular body of work are like that. And the eye has a bunch of derivative parts as well and have come out incidentally on the way.
And do you think, I mean, you were saying, you know, in terms of looking for mechanisms to kind of release ideas or deliver ideas, and for you, how important or you know, how do you like people to access the sort of range of the ideas? And then I think the mean body, it's maybe a bit more, it's a bit more legible, the feeling of your engagement with technology. It's certainly the feeling of the 3D scanner, and that it's written all over the kind of computer. But there, and so we see the technology. And I think in the work here, it's not, there's still an engagement with other kinds of technologies, and let's say apparatuses as well, that it's not quite as legible. And so how does the viewer coming into it access those things? And where is it important for you to support that? So like, is this, for instance, this kind of conversation in the panel that was run here, or publications, do those all play a key role in kind of bringing the ideas to the viewer? Or is it really all, you hope it's all sort of up on the wall and it should be?
Well, certainly.
I told you they were rambling questions.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. As long as you're okay with rambling answers, that might not be very direct. You know, like this piece, The Reliquarium, the fact that it was a listserv diary in the days before spam even had a name. It was a spam diary. I mean, it was both spam and a listserv because people had an option to subscribe, but mostly people were subscribed and they had an option to unsubscribe. It was very important for the first little while after I made it that it was an email performance, but now it's a database, and I think it adds sort of richness to the piece to know that I made it in dialogue with these, you know, sort of 1,700 to 2,000, and sometimes 900. The number of subscribers went up and down, and it was very interesting to see. You know, I would get a flurry of unsubscribes if I put on anything sort of sexually provocative. And I would get, you know, a flurry of subscribes if I got, if I put on things that were political, for example. And it was interesting to watch people's tolerances. And some of the very kind of more painful texts that are maybe more personally revealing solicited all kinds of feedback. Are you okay, dear Reliquarian? Did you sleep last night, dear Reliquarian? I noticed you sent out the post at 4:30 in the morning. Are you sleeping? And people would constantly give me this kind of feedback, or, hey, where are you? You've missed 3 days in a row. Are you well? And so it created a very intimate and intense relationship between me and all of these people who were supporting me with their audienceship. And in a way, that's another project. And this is a remnant of that project. And it's either sort of, it's sort of further derived because now I've taken the material of 254 pairs, and I think there's 92 pieces here. So that's a very small fraction of what's in the database. So the fact that I'm now using it to storytell is yet another project from the same content.
Well, and I think that's, I mean, it's over the years of knowing you and your engagement with the projects, the storytelling around those projects, the work really comes alive in a whole other way. That where the richness and the depth, and sometimes you think, how do you pull on those threads? Is there, and I guess it's interesting to hear you see it as a sort of set of projects that kind of are almost discrete in a way. I've never sort of really thought of it that way, but thought of it as a kind of really fascinating, messy, kind of moving aspect in which, a context like this, and I watched the panel as well that you guys did, and that in those contexts, the work opens up in a way that lots of other work it just can't. It doesn't have that kind of richness and depth in the narrative. And that's still only a fraction of it. I mean, we could probably spend a series of evenings talking about each of the works and the kind of stories that come. But I think then, what I'm curious about and to ask is, in that context, how do you see what the audience will experience when they're in the gallery without this activation? How do you imagine them sort of pulling on those threads?
Well, that's a really good question. Mostly I try not to imagine how they pull on the threads, and I mostly try to sort of make in my sort of autonomous mental state. But it is true that for every decision I make, I seriously consider how it could be read in a multiplicity of takes, if you will. And I look at my work and I sit with my work. The thing that I do most with my work is sit in silence with the work, and I decide what it's saying. And if I adopt this posture, what it's saying. And if I adopt this posture, then what it's saying. And if I have, you know, the third one from the top, you know, on the whatever, fifth one in, whichever, if it's in that place or if it's in that place, then how does it perturb the narrative? And which is the narrative that I stand behind the strongest? Which is the one that speaks to me the loudest? And I really sort of, I feel like I usher my works. In a way they're not my works anymore. In a way they're children. In a way they're living things. And I always believe that it's important to let the idea have a life of its own and to go into dialogue with the work as opposed to trying to kind of wrestle it into a predetermined form that, for which the artist is sort of an executive producer of the work. So I really try to be much more organic in my process than it kind of looks on the surface. And for that reason, sometimes it takes me a long, long time to get the works to a sense where I feel it's completed. And because I kind of relate to them as living things, I fall in love with them, I fall out of love with them, I fall into hate with them, I fall into compassion with them. And as I start to understand my relation to the work and to the content, then I can let it go into the world and be its own thing.
And I think there's a great element of that in Walter Benjamin's The Storyteller, where one of his sort of key aspects of defining what we understand a storyteller to be is that when we're listening to them tell a story, we feel that the storyteller themselves have been implicated somehow in the story, even if just as a witness. They are somehow related. And so I think there's something that comes up in that element in your work, that it's not, they are your process of looking for ideas, but it's also an authorship of a story that we want to see how you are implicated in it as the storyteller. Where does that sort of come from? And I think about the publication for you. Like, what role does the publication play in really in expanding the space of your work, or is it something that other people kind of do?
I think, I haven't had a whole lot of publications, so maybe I don't have a fully formed idea about that. But I think the publication is a gathering together of the various stories and, wrapping, but also something else entirely. The catalog that we're making for this show, we're really approaching it as a thing in and of itself, as opposed to a document gathering the exhibition. And that works for me, because it sort of releases it from a didactic responsibility. I think that good artworks can inspire conversations and more conversations, and there are always a zillion entry points. Like, it's very difficult for me to say that this work is about this, because there are so many entry points. What I need to take into consideration is the whole of my sort of creative, emotional landscape in the context of my life when the thing was being made, and what was I studying, and why was I studying that, and how did certain decisions perturb me into other sort of research paths. And it's not really possible to tell that whole story. And so I recognize that my story of the work is just mine. Once it's in the world, it just doesn't belong to me anymore, and I don't have control over it. And I don't think the publication, I think the publication just gives people like a springboard into their own understanding of what they might be looking at.
The idea of the personal, this comes from watching your the discussion in the panel. One of the things you said, one of the things you said, and the work in the other room with the human remains, and the time in which it took you to open the box. There's a 6-month period that it took you to actually engage directly with the thing inside, and that journey there took you to another continent in order to sort of go through this process. And one of the things you said that really struck me about the idea that this idea of the personal and really the individual is a very culturally relative term, and a culturally relative idea, and that you're I was struck with the thought that you have this body of work, however, that is deeply personal. And how did that process, that experience, affect the way you saw your own work and the work, not just this, say, a shift in a before or after, but in terms of reading the kind of work that you've done on it, suddenly you have this feeling that this personal idea, this singularity that I have been working with, has gone through quite a significant shift.
One of the works that I have completed as part of the Childish Objects body of work that's not in this exhibition is a grid of 4 neon little poems. And one says, recant, recoil, recollect. And one says, breathe. And one says, let go. And one says, awe. And that's a process I take to my ideas. So whenever I start a project, I do have a vision. But as I said, I let go of the vision. It does come from within, but I also have to let go of it and go into dialogue with it as if it were another person or as if it were a child and I was just raising the child. My job is only to usher the work into being. So I'm in a constant state of letting go of my preconception, letting go of my vision, and not dominating the piece, but ushering the piece. So the bones that are in between here and there came to me over years. Over years, I was thinking about this material that when it wasn't in my possession, and imagining what it might be, what it might feel like, the kind of a little bit of the creepy object feeling when I encountered the opportunity to buy them to begin with. And now that I've become informed and educated about the market and human materials, I just don't have that abject creepy feeling anymore. And I think about that as part of my my cultural specificity. And before the show opened, there was a flurry of attention around those bones and who were those bones and where did they come from. And as I educated myself about the medical market and the market in human materials, I realized that it's inappropriate to cast individual onto that set of bones. And I don't relate to it as an individual. It's not an individual. It's a collection of osteological specimens that make up a complete human body. But there's no individual left in there. But I had very sentimental and romantic ideas about this individual that was in the box, as if it was a child that was killed in a war zone. After the trip to India, and in fact, it didn't take much discipline to not open the box. I was very sort of decided in that there's all kinds of stuff I need to learn, and I have this idea, I'm going to open the box and there's going to be this aura that comes out of it, and it's going to be like that scene in Pulp Fiction where the light comes out of the briefcase in the diner, and well, you know, there was none of that. So I thought, you know, well, before I kind of, you know, lose that opportunity to experience the aura, I'm going to really know everything about it. But knowing everything as much as I could about the materials really dismantled the possibility of aura, in fact. I now know that those bones mean something here that they do not mean in India, and that they do not mean in the medical market in general. And for people who work with human materials and specimens and anthropology and medical researchers and educators, bones don't carry an aura. Bones are instrumental to knowledge.
But is that something that shift, is that something that's a personal observation for yourself, or is that something that you want to come through in the work in terms of the kind of let's say, scientific distance that kind of emerges there? A kind of disinterested relationship, and I don't mean disinterested in the sense of dispassionate, but a kind of distance.
Before I opened the box, and while I was in my fundraising phase, I had all kinds of ideas what to do with the bones, even before I knew what the bones looked like. And most of the ideas included assembling the bones into a specific posture to evoke a certain set of narratives about conflict and poverty and over there, out of sight, out of mind. And once I opened the bones, I realized that my primary engagement was with my sort of imaginary of what it might be like to get an individual in a box in the mail. And this was not, it just didn't hold up. This was my own sentimentality, the product of my acculturation. And I didn't feel it was responsible to bring that narrative to the bones at the end of the day, once I really knew what they were. And also, as the years have gone on, and now it's 5 years that I've been doing really hard work about conflict, and I realize that the narratives that I'm deploying and the pieces that I'm asking my audiences to consider are hard and difficult, and I try really hard not to be heavy-handed. Like, I don't want to hammer anybody over the head with my content. I do want to ask you to ask yourselves these questions. I do want to acknowledge my complicity in the work, in the stories that I'm critiquing. I do benefit from, you know, the oil, the plastics that are produced from the oil industry, and I do benefit from, you know, unpaid labor in Bangladesh, and I do benefit from the very seedy market in human materials. And I want to put myself at the center of the critique as well. It's really important for me to take like an ethical posture, in particular with my choice of imagery and my choice of materials. However, with those bones now, I realize that because there are so many complicated narratives, that we all have different narratives about bones and funerary practices and how we ritualize and celebrate life and death. It became imperative to me to leave it as open as possible, but also as respectful as possible within my own sort of belief system. And so in organizing the bones as I do in the shipping box, the very shipping box that they came delivered to me in, I'm asking my audience to consider the same questions that I considered. What do we do with this? I haven't disassembled them. They're still tied with nylon filament, but I have, at the same time, attempted to give it a respectful sort of closure by upholstery in the box as a funerary container.
But in the end, when you have that that approach to it as an audience, again with I think the idea of where these those layers of the story from. I mean, you can imagine then that your story, I mean specifically your relationship to the box, it must be very difficult to interrogate the audience's possible experiences and how those layers, the narrative that they might have access to when there is this kind of the box is the only, because I can imagine the layers of communication, of administration, of bureaucracy, of paper trail, a kind of almost unfathomable layers of bureaucracy, really, you know, sort of apparatus, technology, all of these things that come into and surround what is a very simple box of very powerful organic material. And so, I wouldn't say that it, I just wonder about how difficult that process is to kind of figure out how people are going to approach it. Or not, you know, I can't figure it out, I guess, but, you know, imagine that process and think of what that relationship would be.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Ryan, but it goes back to, for me, it goes back to that I can't anticipate what people are going to take away. I just can't. Like, if we lived in some sort of, like, cultural singularity where everybody was subject to the same traditions, then maybe I might be able to anticipate.
Critique is so deep and I understand that, but and yet I think there's a feeling in you of a kind of, it's not a, like you said, not a heavy-handed critique, but there is something. It's not a journalistic piece. It's not a museum piece. It's not an informative piece. It's, you know, but there is something. There's a kind of a motivation to create an experience, and I guess that's, even if you can't figure out what they're doing, you know, how that process is in understanding that experience.
I went through a lot to give myself permission to put the loose bones in the box as they arrived in the mail. I spent thousands of dollars in order to, you know, release myself from some sort of, you know, that sentimentality is the best way I can describe it. I traveled to India. I traveled to India with my daughter. We breathed a lot of bad air. We met some very interesting people, and we went on quite an adventure to try and understand what a set of osteological specimen might be outside of our cultural context. And I don't know where these bones came from. They might have come from India. They might have come from Taiwan. They might have come from China. I don't know how long they've been in Canada. I don't know how long they've been out of the ground. It's impossible, or never in the ground. In fact, it's just not possible to know. But at the end of the day, I kind of felt like, I understand now that there are multiple possible readings for these bones, and one is scientific and one is, you know, emotional. And when I entered into the project, I thought I was going to make something that was like significantly more heartstringing than what I've presented. But ultimately, I decided to, like, this is a really difficult task for me to decide what, you know, whether it's okay for me to assemble the bones. In my personal kind of ethical position, I didn't want to penetrate the bones. I felt that those bones, as remnants of individual lives, had already been instrumentalized enough, and I didn't want to contribute more than necessary. So I ultimately, you know, I have hardware for assembling it, and ultimately I decided that the best thing to do is just, you know, to leave it. It was loud enough as the loose packaged bones. But ultimately, I am deploying those bones for a very specific narrative about conflict, and the narrative about conflict culture in our global geopolitical situation has very little to do with the bone industry. It is possible to draw lines between conflict and the history of medicine. For sure, those narratives intersect. But that's not really the story that I'm promoting with that work. I'm really trying to use those bones to say, hey, we're making dead people. You know, we're benefiting from the making of dead people. Are we aware of that? Do we want to? I mean, do we stand by that? Do we choose that position? And if we do, and if we don't, well, we should do something different.
And does it, I don't know if frustrate is the right word, but are you surprised that sometimes the discussion maybe is sideways to where that particular question itself about this, and does it fall into a kind of, are we preoccupied with the, well, how does this arrive here? How did this, rather than sort of the conversation that you're pointing to right there?
Well, yeah, if you watch that transcript of the panel, you'll see that I'm frustrated. But the stories that we adopt to keep our head in the sand are sometimes surprising, but not surprising that we want to keep our head in the sand. I can completely. I have spent most of my life trying to keep my head in the sand so that I can happily raise children. I've taken my head out of the sand, and I'm looking around, and I'm looking deeply, and this is what I'm seeing, and I'm bringing it, like a messenger, I'm bringing it. Having been to Sudan, going to Sudan was like opening a Pandora's box. I can't close the Pandora's box now. And so, it feels to me that there's an urgency in giving a very clear message and helping other people just take their head a little bit out of the sand. But it's amazing the things that we don't want to know.
So in that way, it almost becomes kind of part of the artistic strategy, right? That it's only with the kind of reaction of a public and kind of maybe somewhat sideways narrative that it's talked about what the work is talked about that then enables a more direct and passionate access to this discussion. Whereas if you say it directly, it sort of ends up being kind of, yes, we realize we're putting our heads in the sand, but when you present something so powerful that way, and the reaction is to, as it was in the panel, you said, where it's at the end of talking about the bones and where the bones come from, as opposed to this kind of other, more pressing ideas that you want to put on the table. It gives you that, which then again, it cycles back to this really kind of fascinating place where how important these elements for your work are, where they really begin to open up, and not just here in this context, but as it plays out in a kind of in a media discussion about it, as it might play out in a publication, all these different ways where the work sort of expands and pushes up against these different ideas.
I think it's very hard to know what's going on in the world. We're saturated with, very controlled information and propaganda, and unless you actually see it, unless you actually go and see the world, it's not possible to know. I always thought that I was kind of an intense looker. I traveled to places where, I traveled to Haiti as a teenager with my mother and saw lots of babies with bloated bellies and, the knobbly knees of malnutrition. But when I went to Sudan, I thought that I had seen stuff. I'd seen poverty in the Caribbean on numerous trips. I've seen poverty in Canada, I've seen poverty in road trips across the states, shanty towns in the Midwest and in the South. It doesn't look like America. It looks like developing world in a lot of places on our continent. And kind of had that bit of arrogance about me when I went to Sudan. I had no idea how difficult it would be. I had no idea that there were people in the world who had no clothes and no pot to cook in. I didn't know that there was an entire country with zero infrastructure, not even a bridge, not even roads. kind of bare life that exists outside of what we take for granted is very, very intense. It's very awakening to go looking around and looking deeply. You know, if I were a tourist and I had gone to Sudan, I might have gone to Khartoum, I might have gone to Juba. These are the two cities that people know. Wow is another city that some people know in Sudan. But I went to these little villages in the Nuba Mountains who were subject to daily bombings by Antonov, you know, carriers that came from the north. And it's unimaginable to live in those conditions, you know.
I have some questions about photography that probably seem slightly sidetracked by hands. We're going to keep going on that.
Yeah.
Well, and you speak of bare life, and we've talked about gambit and this kind of. I was thinking about the apparatus, but I wonder if another word that is appropriate too is this idea of your interest in systems and your willing desire, I guess, to sort of push yourself and insert yourself into, you know, systems of research, and the military as a system, these kind of and the sort of system of research as it relates to both the bones, but also the research in imaging, the research in as it relates to the eye and production. And so there's these this real desire to sort of somehow expose yourself very deeply into some kind of system or apparatus, and try and either is it to kind of explore its logic, or to extract it as a material itself. What do you when you sort of see this kind of this is a field that I'm going to insert myself into? How do you think as you enter into that?
I guess in retrospect, I don't really feel like I know anything till I've experienced the thing, you know. Maybe I'm not such a good reader. Maybe I have maybe seeing it for myself gives me confidence in the knowledge in a way. Like when I participated in the creation of the camera eye, which I used to think about as a kinetic artwork, and now I just think about it as an obsession. And I ask myself if this piece is about. I ask myself if this piece is about, you know, finishing it or just continuing to make it. When I went I started that piece by participating in an anatomy course at the Ottawa Art Institute where we dissected it was called the anatomy of the orbit, and we dissected the face and the head. First we took off the face to look at the anatomy around the eye itself, the bone structure, the muscular structures, and the lacrimal glands and the nerves and so on. The materials of the eyelid, which the eyelid is a fantastic and crazy awesome piece of material. and then the next day we came back and the anatomy technicians had removed the skull caps from the cadavers we were working on, and we were 2 people per body. We were maybe 18 people in the class, teams, and my partner was a surgical resident. And we were given it's kind of like a treasure hunt. We had to find all these features of the vision system. So we had to follow the optic nerve from the base of the skull into the eye and out the eye, and then dissect the eye. And we weren't allowed to move on to the next until we had demonstrated we had found the relevant piece of anatomy. My biggest takeaway from that experience was that the body is dead and there's no vision out of a dead eye, and vision is very much about living, and vision is vision can be thought of as mechanically within the cadaver, but that ultimately vision is the person and the parsing of what is seen by the eye. And I also discovered that I had no creepy feeling. And I was looking for that.
You just tell me that story. So.
Yeah, it's funny I was looking for it, man. I wanted to have a profound experience of the object, but there was just sheer fascination. And this body that I was working on with my partner was like an old man, and it was an old dead body too. And it was very ugly and smelly like formaldehyde, but there was an intense and overwhelming beauty that was unimaginable, and I would never have thought that this disgusting bit of post-life would be, you know, the remnant of a person, would be so overwhelmingly, awesomely beautiful and chilling. No objection. Just, you know, it was a spiritual experience. I had no idea I was going to end up with a spiritual experience out of that. So I do know that when I thrust myself into a place, something else happens. Like, I wouldn't have known to make that book of source code if I had not been sitting next to the technician. If I was working as in executive craft, I would have ordered the piece from the craftsperson and not have participated. And there's a whole bunch of work that would never have seen the light of day because it wouldn't have dawned on me. And so similarly, that experience in the anatomy lab created a whole new path because I had a transformative spiritual experience from it.
There must be a shift in language for you as well, in the way that not only you talk about it and describe it to perhaps yourself and to people working closely with you, but how you describe it to those technicians / collaborators as you move along. Because I'm sure that in those situations where something transformative happens, that then has to change how you want to get through these other stages of the work. How did that transformative experience of that affect the way that you talk with the 3D modeler, which you must have spent quite a significant amount of time doing a lot of 3D modeling for this? Or do you think there was an issue? Am I just projecting?
My relationship with the people I work with on the eye, it's been several people now that I've, through my work, they've learned the 3D software craft and they've grown up and moved on to become architects and animators and other things. But the person who I work with now has been the same person who I worked with on Mean Body, who was part of a spin-off company from the National Research Council. So we've really been working together for 15 years now. We actually don't really have to talk. I make a few notes, tell him, what I'm looking for, and we're just sort of in sync now after all this time. But it certainly changed the vision for that project. The camera eye was supposed to be roughly what you see as the eye, but after the anatomy experience, it turned into the limbic system. So now I've got this whole steam engine that I'm working on, and seeing the limbic system, which is the piece of anatomy that they call it the animal brain, and it's where the deep emotional fight, freeze type of responses are stored there. And to me, that became more the eye than the eye. Like I said, it's the life force that's projected through the eye, which is for me really the eye. And the life force comes from that place that stores our most traumatic memories and our fears and our compulsions.
Yeah, it's interesting. We started out that question about tools and the relationship of tools and wanting to have this kind of experience of distancing yourself. But in that becomes one of the most important tools that you must have had over these years is a relationship to communication. How crafting this not only communicating ideas through the expression and communicating ideas through material objects, but actually communicating with a whole variety and array. And that you must have seen that sort of transform over the years.
There's no internet connection right now because we're in airplane mode.
Transformative experience.
Perfect. Perfect.
But yeah, at this scale and working in this way, communication becomes the kind of the ability to communicate, and not just, I don't just mean that in the sense of like, make sure I know how to tell them what to do, but the kind of two-way communicative experience that you've probably crafted.
Yes, I've become a very practical speaker, I guess, in my community. I remember like in the early 2000s when I was doing a lot of work with policy development with the Canada Council and the funders and so on, and the arts funders and academic funders too. In fact, our whole spectrum of funding in Canada was really looking to what is art and technology and what is art science. And I did a lot of research for the Canada Council and the Arts Councils and the various funding councils. How does art fit into scientific discovery, and how does scientific discovery fit into art, and how do people work across disciplines, or art, technology, technologists? And it always came down to language. The first thing that anybody needed to do was build a common set of language tools. And along with building a common set of language tools, we could build trust, because then we could understand each other. And it's through that trustful communicating that we can develop innovation. It's what it really comes down to, that cross-pollination that was a very important kind of buzzword at the time of pre-2010. And now I find that other things happen, some serendipities happen in the work that are incredibly beautiful. And in a way they come from not communicating, just allowing things to unfold and accepting how, like in the video piece, for example, here we are, I pull a crew together, I'm trying to find a field, everything came together in this magic moment. The sun rose and the sun went down, and the halo around the little girl, and it just happened to be, perfectly, the piano happened to be perfectly placed. The crew was, for all of us it was a meditation. It was a very intense project because we had basically 2 days and no rehearsal. And a little girl who had not experience in durational performance, that's for sure. I personally didn't train her on the piano, but I funded her training on the piano to play the particular selections. And the camera guy, Victor, his name was, ended up with a very particular relationship with her, and she happened to be a very precocious and flexible girl who was able to be directed basically by 2 directors and keep her attention on both of us all the time. And the cows come into the scene at exactly the right time, and it was just amazing. It was like the lab, the anatomy lab in a way. It was it's almost spiritual coming together. It just kind of happened, and then there's no editing needed. It's just you go with the flow, and sometimes it just flows.
So I think it just happens to come to the end. So thank you very much for a lovely conversation. Thanks to the. Oh, sorry. Do we know other people? I thought we were just talking.
Just you and I.
Are there any questions from the audience? It looks like it.
Let's start here.
I think the experience you had with the cadaver, where you said it was profoundly beautiful and it was out of something that was ugly, and it was a spiritual experience for you. What was it about that moment that made it so beautiful for you?
I had this realization that everything that we ever thought of or built outside of us pre-existed the outside by being inside. The most exquisite taffeta reminds the skull, for example. The structures of the veins. The fact that the nerves travel through these perfect little foramen channels. They're called foramen, the holes in the bone that the nerves travel through. They're perfectly kind of radiated, and on the eye, I'm always paying attention to what is the radius of the edge. That's the arc of the edge, because I don't want to have a corner. There are no corners in the body, you know. There's no room inside the head for anything else. Of course, you completely understand why a traumatic head injury would lead to, you know, massive trauma very quickly, because no room for the blood, you know. So it's sort of perfectly organized and extremely efficient in its use of space, and the use of its own space, yeah, it's like the eyelid. The eyelid is like a little piece of armor. It's incredibly hard. It was difficult to, I mean, you couldn't push through it with any of the tools. We had to cut it from the edge. And similarly to the material that lines the skull. It's like taffeta, but there's no rectilinear. I mean, it's like taffeta in that it's iridescent, but there's no linear warp and weft. It's like crazy random. Everything is overlapped. And it completely makes sense as to why it's so strong. Because there's no order to sort of find, for a sharp object to find its way through. And so the head was full of these moments of how could, I mean, there is no more perfect material to perform this task, or perfect pathway to get the nerve from the neck to the eye, you know? So the design is incredible. Well, you know, I resist calling it design, right? But it sort of is very architectural at the same time. Thank you.
My question is the absence of aura. I find it interesting that there's an absence of aura in the box of bones when you have preconceived ideas and expectations, and the spirituality, the contrast with the spirituality with the eye, and the cadaver where you experience aura there. What would cause this difference in the experience, or it just is?
Productization, I guess, would be my short answer to that. When I open the bones, I'd already been in India, I'd already seen how people let go of their body, burn the body, cremate the body, throw the remnants into the Ganges. In India, they call it "my wife expired." In Calcutta, a friend that we met along the way, they call it expired, as if shedding a body, like shedding and leaving behind a cocoon. And it allowed me to think of the body in other ways, in much more, you know, in a deeply spiritual society, the body is more vehicle, but in a secular society, we're very materialist. We have much more invested in our meat, I think, than in deeply spiritual societies. And so I had an opportunity to encounter basically a counter-narrative. And, but there was this issue of that I was sold this thing through photos, right? I was sold the collection of bones through photos of the bones and description of the bones, and yet I hadn't opened the box. And so I waited until I got back from India to open the box. And some weeks, actually, after I returned from India, I went into quiet reflection and I opened the box. And lo and behold, they didn't give me the right skull. They gave me a skull with Victorian markings that was old and, you know, Dijon mustard yellow and had all the quadrants in ink. And somehow it just turned into, I ordered a pair of blue jeans and they've given me brown jeans. I have to call the company and I have to write the situation. And so it just sort of, it just very quickly turned into product. Now I had to research how much the value was. They said, okay, we'll give you your money back. Well, now I have to ask, do I want my money back or do I want the bones? And I had to research the bone industry in North America again to see if I could even replace those bones. Ultimately, we negotiated a replacement of the skull. But it was a negotiation. It was commerce, and was market, and it was the commerce and the productization of the materials and the negotiation over the materials that emptied the aura from the object.
So it wasn't cultural. It wasn't, you were not infiltrated by the perception of the exploration of the body, the exploration of the individual. You were not influenced by that, you know, having that psyche, and then culturally here, you immersed yourself, or you became influenced by how the body is perceived here. It's not an exploration. There's seemingly more dignity, even though you mentioned that bones are interpreted in different arenas differently. But still, for all, culturally, we still have some lack of respect, or some level of respect. And so the aura came with that. Are you saying that there was, because of the productization, there was really no
room for aura? But the other thing is, I'm a secular person. I'm a spiritual person, but I'm a secular person. And at the moment, you know, when push came to shove, I default to my place.
Yes.
And so, to me, they became specimens. They were specimens, you know, not remains. You know, to be like brutally honest, that's mine. Yeah, that's my position on it.
So perhaps you could say something about those lovely little black creatures with their wings that you've added to that scenario.
Any kind of anything in particular?
Well, why add them? Why not just have? Because you've added something to that installation that it's certainly not like Hero. It's not like you know, the sound, for example, evokes the way you know up there. So it's not. It takes it outdoors.
The butterflies came from, like, my first idea was the story of 1,000 Cranes. And the story of 1,000 Cranes was it's a Japanese story. And it was popularized in a children's book. It was a story of a girl who was exposed, who was radiated in Hiroshima. And the 1,000 Cranes are, the idea of folding 1,000 Cranes is to bring good luck or good health or best wishes or, you know, good fortune onto somebody, usually a married couple or the birth of a baby. And so the story of Sudaku was that she folded these, endeavored to fold 1,000 Cranes to heal herself from the leukemia that she got as a result of being radiated. And then in the story, she folds some 600 and something Cranes before she dies. And so that is that children's story written by an American author that popularized the 1,000 Cranes here. And as I said, there was something significantly more sentimental and heartstringing that I was pursuing as the idea and the vision for the piece before, like at the beginning of it. And so it started with 1,000 Cranes, and I started researching them, and I wanted to deploy the cliche, but I was sort of like reluctant to work too close to that cliche. And so rather than calling them 1,000 Cranes, I started calling them winged things. And letting go of the cranes and going into kinetic winged things. And it brought me to works of Rebecca Horn, and Rebecca Horn is an artist who made these little kinetic butterflies. And the loss of the monarchs and what the death of the monarchs means within our culture, and how do I take this Japanese story and bring it home to a Canadian cultural framework. And then so I came to the monarchs, but I wanted to choose a butterfly that was not a monarch butterfly, and in fact it's not a butterfly. I mean, this is an invented butterfly. It's a riff off of, it's a monarch wing riffing with a Congolese, can't remember the name of it, butterfly. And, but for me, the butterfly occupies the space between life and death, and that they're carrying the spirit of the dead into another realm. But also very pragmatically, I wanted to add a moving element, a time-based element to that piece to soften the room, because I felt that the work was too austere and too hard. And so I felt that the butterflies would, you know, give it a gentle entry point.
It does.
Another question? Yeah.
My question is quite personal in some respects.
because the question I'd like to ask you and get your response from is art in the 21st century. I have this very strange feeling that the artists in the 21st century are really lost, and they try to find a new way of expressing themselves. And the reason I say this is because I also am familiar with Walter Benjamin's work as well about art in the age of mass production. And he was very much concerned about the issue of the relationship between the machine and the capacity to reproduce things. And obviously in the 20th century this was very much explored as well. But it seems that we reach now a point in the 21st century where somehow or other the machine is now so dominant and so taken over that somehow the artist has a role, and that is to try to open up our minds to the recognition about that we are really, the machine has taken over, that we are now, controlled by the machine. And I think this is very important, because I think the artist is an extraordinarily important role, because the artist opens up other people to recognize there's something there that they can see, and you refer to as vision. Is an illusion, and then you try to express the vision and promote or put it into some sort of form in which someone else then has the experience that you're transferring your vision into someone else's experience. But it was in the traditional art with the great Renaissance art. If you look at the art of the 19th century and the Impressionists, you could see that the communication of the artist and people there was some sort of very important kind of communication process going on, and it was responded to. And I think I got a feeling there's something that's lost. I've looked at whether many exhibitions, art exhibitions, and I feel that this generalized communication is missing. And I just wanted to know what your thoughts are with respect to this issue involving me personally.
I'm educated as a photographer, so I'm kind of native with tools. I don't draw, for example. I don't draw and paint. I do all kinds of things, but I do not draw and I do not paint. I have sort of a fundamental insecurity of letting go from my hand. And I think that's what's lost. That my work is so heavily mediated that it's not, I think about my work as being direct. It's very direct in its relationship to the viewer, but it's very indirect for me, because either I need tools or I need things or I need people in order to exorcise my ideas. So yeah, in a way I mourn my dependency on tools, but that's my craft is tools. There are a lot of things about the eye and this whole kind of strange fetishization that we're doing about 3D printers right now, which is raising 3D printers to some level of rarefication, when there's not much a 3D printer can do that a crafted, well-talented hand can't do. And so I think, like, I do agree with you that there's something in education now that's being sort of missed out on, but I have no doubt that it's going to cycle back again.
I think to comment on something that for you and your practice, and something we really talk about, say, the influence of sort of feminist thinking and feminist artists over the course of your career, but I think its relationship to technology is really key, and I think what's emblematic of work that she's doing at certain points is to actually how does an artist and how can an artist inhabit technological structures in order to open up and make them different and think differently about them, because they are quite totalizing. We are completely immersed in a technological society, and there is no outside of that in which you can sort of retreat to. And artists like Nicola become quite fascinating because of their ability to enter into it quite deeply. And I think, Mean Body is certainly an actual, you're looking at those structures very, very directly in that idea of representation of the body, the female body, and bringing a lot of that right directly to the image representation and the technology around that. But I think it permeates sort of all of your work in different ways, this idea of how can we inhabit the idea of and the experience of technology in a different way to open up a different kind of conversation. So that's I'm not answering for it, but I'm offering.
No, but that's true, because one of the things that I have brought to my technological works, and especially the sculptural work, is organic curves. And organic curves are not typically machine-made. And certainly the organic curves of the body and the complexity of the shapes that I'm asking the tool to produce is pushing the boundaries of the capacity of the tools. But I think that also, like, we're creating another aura and using the tool to invest new kinds of materials with different kinds of auras.
Question on family.
I think you touched upon it in like a couple of different ways, but not so directly. After your experience with the dissection of the eye and examining the interior structure as like something in perfect architecture of the system, and knowing that the body is neat, that the body is like intentionally created neat, how did you expect to find personhood in terms of the structure that would carry that weight when you would buy bodies? And like the 5 years from acknowledging that the body is a structure, where did you expect to like embed a personhood onto that structure again?
That's a really good question. That's why I say it comes from sentimentality. And naivete. Like it really wasn't, for me, because I was so invested in the dead that are being created over there, in the conflicts and in the wars and in the rubble in Palestine, and the children and the children and the children, that I was hoping that these bones would stand for those children, and those children do have personhood. Until I actually went to India and we saw what we saw. Nicola came to India with me. And then I came back and I looked at it, and then I opened the bones. I realized that there's a world apart between the specimen and the dead child in Palestine, in the rubble in Palestine. And that the bones were mere material to invoke that life that was, once lived and lost and disrespected and undignified. And so yeah, that's why I call myself out and say, well, it was fantasy, it was magical thinking, it was pulp fiction, and really the bones are bones. There is no person.
Can I just make one observation? I felt compelled to take your photograph, and I wish that I had videotaped this, or I hope it is videotaped. I think just having the audio is a little bit of a, diminishes from the intensity here. And I felt I was drawn to take your picture because of the transformation that took place when you started to talk about your experience in Sudan. You changed. Yeah. And it would be, I don't know if...
It was a good thing that Ryan caught me, because one of the things I learned about Sudan is that I can talk for a day for every minute I was in Sudan.
I think that might be a good place. Maybe if we just want to carry it out and have more conversation over drinks. Thank you so much.
Thank you.